these existentialist thinkers, they were trying to describe a shared experience, which is, for example, what does it mean to be in the world? What is choice? What is decision? What is authenticity? So these are concepts that Muslims can draw upon because they are trying to describe an existing state of affairs rather than expressing a certain normative commitment or a sort of a kind of metaphysics. So as long as you have an Islamic framework, clear normative metaphysical commitments, you can subordinate certain secular concepts to understand your own tradition. But what would be negative and counterproductive is to have a secular framework and subordinate Islamic concepts to it.
Peace, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Real Talk Podcast with Tehran and Roxana. Today, we have a very special guest with us to discuss some of the ideas and key concepts from his recent publication titled Against the World, Towards an Islamic Liberation Philosophy. He is an independent researcher, Muslim philosopher, and author who has studied at the American University of Beirut. His research interests includes Islamic thought, political theory, and liberation theology. We are very pleased to welcome Ustad Ali Harfoush. Assalamu alaikum, brother, and how are you doing?
Wa alaikum salam. Alhamdulillah, I'm very good. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, yeah, and thanks for accepting our invitation. For myself, your book Against the World was a very interesting read, although I must admit it's not a topic related to Islam that I'm used to inquiring about. It nonetheless opened me up to a world of Islamic thought I hadn't known about previously. So before we get into it, could you let us know a little bit about yourself and what inclined your research interests and views towards Islamic thought, political theory, and liberation theology more specifically? And then I'm also a bit curious, like, is there a difference between liberation theology and liberation philosophy? Because I noticed that philosophy was the word that you chose to use, but every time I looked up anything related to Islamic liberation thought, theology was always added.
Yeah, so I was born and raised in the United States. I come from a Lebanese background. I did my bachelor's degree and my master's degree in political studies from the American University of Beirut. So in 2008, I left the United States and I moved to Beirut with the intention of becoming politically active with Islamic movements. And that's what I did for 10 years. So my interest in liberation theology, liberation philosophy, contemporary Islamic political thought emerged out of my experience with these Islamic movements working on the ground in the Muslim world, especially in the post-Arab Spring period. So my interest was sparked from that type of engagement.
And can you provide an overview of Islamic liberation theology, its core principles, and how it distinguishes itself from other Islamic theological perspectives?
Okay, so I would say that to understand Islamic liberation theology, we have to understand what does it show its fidelity, right? So an Islamic liberation philosophy is a philosophy or a theology that shows fidelity, one, to our metaphysical commitment, which is Tawheed, two, a fidelity to our normative sources, which is the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and number three, a fidelity to the oppressed, solidarity to the oppressed. So it emerges out of a sense of righteous anger that is felt when one witnesses oppression and injustice. Now, the subject matter of Islamic liberation theology is the question of oppression. In the same way, for example, that the subject matter of Ilmul Kalam, right, is, for example, the names and attributes of God, the problem of evil, the question of time, in Christian theology, scholastic theology, and so forth. Whereas the subject matter of Islamic liberation theology is the question of oppression and subsequently the question of liberation. So liberation theology is distinct not by the methods that it employs, and I think we can get to that later, but it is distinct in that its subject matter is oppression. That is the object that it seeks to try to understand, illuminate, and act upon.
Okay, so what historical or socio-political factors influenced its emergence and development? Was there any key event or a series of scholars that kind of helped um, this form of Islamic thought emerge?
Okay, so as I was saying, right, liberation theology emerges as a reaction to oppression and injustice, right? It emerges not only as this contemplation on injustice, but also a feeling of anger against injustice. Okay, so that said, you have Christian liberation theology, which emerged in the 1970s in Latin America as a result of the injustices of dependent capitalists, of savage capitalism, authoritarian national security states, and so forth. In the Muslim world, it emerged with figures such as Malcolm X, and we all know the context that Malcolm X emerged in, and the context where his thought emerged in, right? Systemic racism against blacks in the United States. And then you have, for example, figures like Ali Shariati. Ali Shariati was reacting to the Pahlavi dynasty regime and its military apparatus and its secret police and so forth. And then you have more contemporary liberation theologians like Farid Isaak, who was reacting against the South African apartheid regime. And then you have other liberation theologians, for example, Hamid Dabashi, who is speaking within the context of a contemporary Iran and so forth. So liberation theology emerges as a lived experience. It's not a theology that emerges from the armchair theologians, or that emerges from academia. It emerges from a concrete experience of injustice and oppression, and subsequently contemplation upon that state of oppression and injustice. That's what gives birth to liberation theology. And that's what really produced my own work, spending 10 years in the Muslim world, experiencing oppression, experiencing injustice, and reacting to it through contemplation, which ultimately took the form of a book.
And do you think, in terms of all of this discussion around, well, the fact that oppression is the thing that triggers is Islamic liberation theological thought, does Islamic liberation theology have a very peculiar or specific way of addressing that social injustice or inequality and political oppression that diverges from other liberation theology from other traditions?
That's a very good question. Yes, it does, because Islam has its own distinct conception of man, its own distinct conception of God, and its own distinct conception of the cosmos. So it follows that it would have its own ways of dealing with the question of injustice, with dealing with the question of oppression, and dealing with other theological questions such as the problem of evil, man-God relations, man-cosmos relations, and so forth. I want to take this as an opportunity, though, to address one particular point, which is that, okay, that's all fine, that all sounds nice, but what does it mean in terms of method to engage with the Quran and Sunnah and trying to understand what is man, what is oppression, what is injustice, what is liberation, so forth? There might be a misconception that an Islamic liberation theology is a new faith or a new theology, a new way of doing theology. This is not true. Islamic liberation theology draws on the rich tradition in Islamic history. It does not neglect it. It does not try to break away with it. That's one. Number two, how does Islamic liberation theology engage with the Quran? There is a mode of hermeneutics, a mode of tafsir in Islamic scholarship called tafsir al-mawdu'i, which means a thematic tafsir. So this form of tafsir looks at themes in the Quran and tries to derive from it certain principles. So Islamic liberation theology essentially looks at themes in the Quran, such as what is man, what is oppression, what is injustice. For example, by looking at the story of Moses and Pharaoh, right? And it tries to extrapolate from these verses certain key themes. So in that sense, Islamic liberation theology does not break from the Quran, and it does not break from a very rich tradition. It builds on it, and with a attitude of retrieval. Yeah, so I just thought I should clarify that particular possible misconception. because sometimes people might associate Islamic liberation theology with some kind of progressivist trend that is modernist.
Modernity, basically.
Yes.
And I
Speaking
will say that on the outset, that is the assumption that I had when I first started to inquire your book, Islamic Liberation Philosophy. I thought it was something that only arose spontaneously as of recent times and had a more progressive leftist. Not saying that those things are necessarily bad, but I definitely was categorizing it in that camp from the outset. But thank you for that clarification.
Yeah, I mean, also we can look at it. Islamic liberation theology draws on the very prophetic movement in Mecca, right? So the Prophet ﷺ was reacting to certain injustices and oppressions in Mecca, and that's why the poor and the downtrodden rallied around the Prophet, such as Bilal, Suhaib al-Rumi, among others. So the Islamic liberation theology also draws its inspiration from the Sunnah, in particular the Seerah, the Seerah of the Prophet, and it reads the Seerah as a prophetic movement, and not merely as an aggregate of actions that the Prophet took up in a particular time and in a particular place. It sees the prophetic life as a integrated, active, and dynamic movement, which culminated in Medina.
In terms of the engagement with sort of Quranic hermeneutics in relation to your arguments that you make in the book, you open your book with the words, "We live in an age beset by an idolatrous trinity, the state, the self, and capital." And you go on to elaborate that this sort of idolatrous trinity is governed by a network of what you refer to as second creators. Can you explain who or what you are referring to by that term, and how the concept of an idolatrous second creator relates, in your view, to the Quranic concepts of Taghut and Tawheed?
Okay, so to clarify, I borrowed this term from Sherman A. Jackson in his book Islam and the Black American. So a second creator means, like the title, like the name implies, that we are referring to individuals or systems that recreate man and society in its own image. So, for example, the neoliberal order, the neoliberal capitalist order, it recreates man in its own image. So man goes from the primordial Adamic self, the dignified man, to a consumer, because he has been recreated in the image of the capitalist or the neoliberal order. Same with the secular state, same with other modalities of power and whatnot. So the second creator is to recreate man, God, and the cosmos in the image of the state, in the image of the order. Okay, and then these these new images are made to appear as though they represent the natural way of things, as though they are insurmountable realities, as opposed to being the product of certain power configurations and so forth. So they appear to be natural. They appear to be real, quote unquote. So now this is a form of transgression, because in Islam, meaning is imbued, meaning is derived from a divinely ordained order, which is the mizan, the balance, right? Wherein everything has its proper place. So in recreating man in its own image, the order, the neoliberal order, the secular order, the transgressive Qurayshi order, and so forth, it transgresses its place in the divinely ordained order, which is the mizan. Hence, it is a taghut, because a taghut literally means the one who transgresses.
Okay. And your conceptualization of what the Muslim Ummah should be in response to these second creators is very interesting. So you state that the Muslim Ummah should be viewed not as an aggregate of individuals, but instead as almost like a living organism with a very distinct direction and purpose. Can you explain, so you engage very creatively with sort of etymological origins of the word ummah. Can you explain how this idea stems from the etymology of the word ummah, and what you think the consequences would be for Muslims if they adopted this understanding of the term?
Okay, so the Prophet ﷺ says that the believers are like one body. So that's where I drew the idea of the organism and so forth, as being as though it's an organism. So one of the things I try to do in my book is try to shift the way we understand agency, right? The capacity to act, capacity to be conscious. So we tend in a secular age, in a liberal age, in a stage of nation states, to think of agency on the individual level or at the level of identity politics. So, for example, this idea that I, as an American Muslim, am a minority, or as a Muslim in the UK, I am a minority, or as a Muslim in Canada, I am a minority. So instead of understanding agency through an individual or minority lens, I wanted the reader to view and understand agency at the level of the global ummah. And this empowers them to think about new spaces and new horizons for thought and action. So when you go from I am a minority to I am a member of a global ummah, obviously the horizons of thought and action change and expand. I also use the word ummah and the etymology of the word ummah, which means a quest to head towards something, a destiny, because the very word ummah, it's very interesting. The very word ummah connotates, it signifies something, which is that a nation that has no vision is not an ummah. Simply, it's just an aggregate of individuals. So for us to exist as an ummah, so it's an existential question. It's an existential question, because for us to exist as an ummah, as an Islamic ummah, we must have a vision. There must be some sort of destination. There must be some image of the self that guides that vision and guides those actions.
Yeah, that the way that you articulated ummah in your book really stood out to me, and I really, vibed with that. That an ummah is a direction, and when we don't have no direction, we cease being a ummah. That was something that really resonated with me, and I hope more when people inquire your book, that's something that they tend to sit and think about as well, because the way that you laid it out and articulated it, like I mentioned, really hit me. But the discourse around multiculturalism in the West often promotes the necessity of building assimilated, hibernated identities for religious and ethnic minorities, identities that allow Muslim minorities to maintain some tradition in a sense of Muslimness, as it were, but only within a dominant secular paradigm. In contrast, your book repeatedly calls upon Muslims to reclaim what you term an alterity. How would that practically manifest for you, and why is it necessary for the ummah to have a sense of alterity?
Okay, so let me clarify what alterity means, because it's somewhat of a technical term. So to understand alterity, you can think of a factory worker whose day job is to pull a lever. Okay, now this factory worker is an instrument within a totality, which is the factory. He's a cog in a machine, okay? However, this factory worker possesses alterity as a potentiality. Why? Because he can choose not to pull that lever. He can choose to take up a different occupation. He can choose to join a union, right? So he is not reducible to an instrument within a totality, the factory, or a cog in the machine, because he always has the capacity to choose a different course of action. So that's what alterity is. So when I speak of myself as an American Muslim, I am stripping myself of my alterity, because I become part of a totality called America, right? Or the American order, the horizons that constitute America, wherein the borders of the United States become the borders of my thinking, and so forth. Whereas when I think of myself as part of a global ummah, I am retrieving my alterity. Now, the key to reclaiming alterity is the autonomy of thought, right? The autonomy of consciousness. Now, in Islam, this is expressed in Tawheed. So as long as we have metaphysical commitments that are divinely ordained, divinely revealed, then we maintain an alterity vis-a-vis any sort of power structure.
I.e. the secular liberal project.
Exactly. So now, in practical terms, what does this mean? And I'm glad you asked this question. So in practical terms, the way I see it, the way I understand it, and in a future book, I will be talking about strategic imperatives for Islamic liberation theology. But this is something I couldn't do in my book. But I think that on a practical level, what this means is that we must have a strategic vision as an ummah. As an ummah in the UK, United States, Canada, in the Muslim world, in the global north and global south. So there has to be a strategic vision. There has to be a strategy of self-determination and there has to be a strategy of grassroots activism. And why grassroots activism? Because grassroots activism is autonomous, meaning it acts independently of the formal channels of power, such as parliamentary participation, voting, and so forth, which are largely, in my opinion, ineffective means of political participation. So grassroots activism is a form of autonomy. It is a form of reclaiming your alterity at the level of action.
Okay, so what you mean by alterity isn't necessarily mean just Roxana and I talked about it. I want to say that she may have articulated a little bit better than I did, but I'm going to try my best. In the time that we're living in, where Muslims are constantly charged with not assimilating, not participating in the societies they live in, it seems like alterity kind of pushes Muslims in the direction in which some others may complain about Muslims within their society, about how they're not assimilating. It seems like alterity kind of promotes an assimilation project for Muslims. Is that the case? That's the way that I kind of seen it when I was reading your book, and I just wanted you to kind of clarify, how do we square anti-assimilation sentiments from non-Muslims that we live amongst, and also kind of maintain a certain alterity within a society that promotes a secular liberal project?
Okay, so again, that's a very good question. Okay, so we have to understand something, right? That even within the United States, under the so-called melting pot, okay, the state and the culture enforces a particular subjectivity. So the question is not, do we maintain some sort of neutral identity wherein different parties can engage with one another? The question is, which of these subjectivities do we embrace? Is it that of the nation state or that of Islam and our own culture and our own normative commitments? So there is a hegemonic subjectivity, there is a hegemonic identity, which is the identity that is imposed by the nation state, whether in the United States or in or the US or Canada. So the idea of multiculturalism is a myth, because there is one culture that is imposed on the rest. Now, in maintaining our alterity and self-determination, this does not mean that we disassociate with the community. Quite the opposite. Our own normative commitments as Muslims obligates us to creatively and fruitfully engage with our non-Muslim other, with our neighbors, right? So this is part and parcel of our tradition of engaging with mercy with the non-Muslim other, with the Christians, the Jews, and other emergent members of religious sects. And I would actually here recommend that you look into the words of Farid Isaak. So Farid Isaak talks about pluralism in relation to Islamic liberation theology.
And actually, he is one person whose work I inquired a bit in preparation for this podcast, and I found a lot of what he said to be very enlightening. And just back on the Secular Liberal Project, you talk about the Secular Liberal Project is a project of disenchantment in which a monotheistic metaphysical understanding of man, God, and the cosmos is concealed and denied. This is very similar to the rhetoric we hear from neo-traditionalist sheikhs like Hamza Yusuf, Abdul Hakim Murad, and Umar Farouk Abdullah, who talk about how the crisis of secular modernity has resulted in a phenomenon of disenchantment and has obfuscation, phenomenon of disenchantment and the obfuscation of a metaphysical worldview. Their solution to this, however, is to focus on reviving tradition and to offer an escape from political realities by encouraging their followers to adopt a path of quietist introspection rather than political activism. Why do you think, despite coming to the same conclusions about the effects of secular modernity, expressed in a very similar language, your solution to this problem diverges quite profoundly?
So let me clarify something from the onset. Okay, for starters, not engaging in politics is a political decision. It is a decision. It is to hand over your fate to somebody else who might not have your best interests in mind.
Wow.
So not engaging in politics is a political decision. Okay.
Which is something that I always say. I don't engage in politics, and maybe I should stop saying that.
Yes. Oh, I hope by the end of this interview, you'll be encouraged to engage in politics.
Yeah, because I never thought about it the way that you just put it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So let me also clarify something. There's this misconception that activism falls within the purview of the intellectuals and the activists, whereas quietism falls within the scope of the ulama, of the scholars. This is not true. Okay, the founders of most Islamic movements, the founders of Islamic activism were scholars, were Muslim scholars. Abu al-A'la al-Mawdudi of Al-Jama'ah al-Islamiyya in Pakistan, Israr Ahmad of the Tanzim al-Islami in Pakistan, Yusuf al-Qaradawi in his relationship to the Muslim Brotherhood, Taqiyuddin al-Nabahani and the founding of Hizb al-Tahrir, and Abd al-Salam Yassin and the Tanzim no, in Morocco. I forgot the name of them. Al-Adala wa Tanmiya. Okay, so Islamic activism was born out of a scholarly community. Now, I think the reason that we diverge is because paradoxically, these neo-traditionalists, they adopt a modern conception of politics. They understand politics to be a space of pure power, right? And when you understand politics in that sense, and you limit your understanding of politics to the exercise of power, which is a very Weberian understanding of politics, then naturally you're going to adopt the quietist approach. In contrast, Islamic liberation theology understands politics as a virtuous vocation, as a calling. It understands politics as grassroots empowerment. It understands politics as a space wherein we actualize our potential as an ummah. So we don't understand politics as being limited to the formal channels of participation, voting, and parliamentary politics, but we understand politics to be much more than that. Politics as being a mode of empowerment, empowering a community.
In terms of what you've said about Islamic liberation theology, and what you've mentioned in your book, you make a lot of references to the thought of famous revolutionary Shia thinker Ali Shariati in your work. And I've seen you also frequently recommend his texts on your social media. Why do you view his work so highly? And do you think his ideas are underappreciated outside of Shia discussion circles? And do you think sectarian divisions create almost counterintuitive enclaves which separate out Muslim thinkers and prevent a cross engagement between sectarian thought?
So the reason I like to draw on Ali Shariati is because Ali Shariati understood, at least this is my reading of Ali Shariati, that he understood the crisis of the Muslim world as an existential crisis, rather than merely being a political, intellectual, spiritual crisis. So he elevated the political question or the economic question to an existential level. So that is why I draw on Ali Shariati. Similarly, his solution to our crisis is this idea of the return to the self, right? Escaping our state of alienation, which is similarly an existential response to an existential crisis. So that's where I see Ali Shariati to be most fruitful. Now, I think as a result of schisms that existed in the history of our ummah and colonial politics, there is this sectarianism where we have no problem engaging in interfaith with Christians and Jews, but for one reason or another, we can't engage with our Shia brothers and sisters. And I find this to be very disheartening, because there's a lot that we can learn from the Shia experience, especially leading up to the 1979 revolution. So we can learn from Ali Shariati, we can learn from Al-Mutahhari, and so forth.
Like Shariati, you are very, very critical of scholastic philosophy, in particular singling out sort of the tradition of Ilm al-Kalam, and you feel that it's sort of disengaged from contemporary political realities and diverts attention from the existential consensus, for example, Shariati focuses his work on. Some, however, might levy the charge of sort of engaging in what you refer to as sort of ivory tower philosophy at your own book, because it has very dense, it's very complex, it uses quite esoteric philosophical language that an entry-level reader who is not acquainted with the theorists that you refer to might struggle to grasp, how would you respond to that particular charge? And how do you endeavor to make your ideas accessible in a way that might actually impact a wider Muslim praxis?
And that's a very fair criticism. I do hope to release a second book that it will be more accessible in terms of the language. So I should state from the onset that this is a philosophical text. Right? It's a philosophical text that engages with certain concepts that require philosophical engagement. And this book is aimed at intellectuals in the Muslim world. Now, that being said, another important clarification is that I am not critical of Ilm al-Kalam or scholastic philosophy. I am critical of limiting and rendering it to be the exclusive, rendering it to be the exclusive purview of a scholarly class, which is the mutakallimin. This is what I'm critical of. And I'm critical of limiting the subject matters of Islamic metaphysics to theological debates, such as the names and attributes of God, or the question of time, and the question of second causality and first causality, and so forth. So what I'm trying to say is that, okay, let us extend this very same sophisticated and discursively deep engagement with our tradition, Ilm al-Kalam, let's extend that to questions of oppression, questions of economic exploitation. For example, what does Ilm al-Kalam have to tell us about the question of Marxism? What can our metaphysical commitments tell us about secularism? What can our metaphysical commitments tell us about the origins of oppression and the means of liberation? So yes, Ilm al-Kalam is a very sophisticated and discursively deep philosophy, and we can retrieve certain aspects of it in trying to understand our present historical situation. But again, we should not limit the purview and the scope of Ilm al-Kalam to certain theological questions that are 1400 years old and that still haven't been resolved.
So what you're saying is basically that Ilm al-Kalam needs to be able to respond to what we're dealing with today, not just previous discussions, medieval discussions that I don't want to say have no relevance in our societies today, because they very much have relevance in the individual lives of every Muslim who studies and who does not study. I mean, excuse me, I'm stumbling over my words, but so what you're basically saying is that Ilm al-Kalam needs to extend further than the previous discussions and discourse that it has been a part of previously, which seems to be centered more so around in a period in medieval times.
Yeah, and just to clarify also as well, there are certain themes in Ilm al-Kalam that are relevant to our contemporary historical situation. So, for example, the problem of evil and the problem of suffering. This is the question of theodicy. So this is a question that the scholars dealt with, the Ash'arites, the Maturidis, the Atharis, and so forth. So Sherman, for example, Sherman A. Jackson, again, in his book, Islam and the Problem of Black Suffering, retrieves the question of theodicy among these three schools and applies it to the question of Black suffering. So in addition to expanding the scope of Ilm al-Kalam, we can also retrieve existing debates that occurred within Ilm al-Kalam centuries ago onto our contemporary situation. So again, I'm not calling for a break with Ilm al-Kalam or a discontinuity with Ilm al-Kalam.
Let's develop it further.
Developing it further, exactly.
All right. And on the topic of oppression, you talk constantly about the prioritizing of supporting the oppressed that is inherent to the Quranic worldview. Do you think that oppressed civilians in the Muslim world would instinctively identify with your existentialist reading of Quranic concepts like the Ummah and Tawheed?
Yes, 100%. And this stems from my experience on the ground with the Muslim Ummah for 10 years in the Muslim world. There is a very strong Islamic sentiment across the Muslim world, and there's a very strong sense of ummatic solidarity across the Muslim world. And one only needs to look at the situation in Gaza and the sentiments emerging from Gaza, or the sentiments and the thought that is emerging from other sectors of the Muslim world like Kashmir. Now, interestingly enough, Stephen Simon of Rand Corporation. Now, Rand Corporation, you can say, it's the ideological wing of the American empire. It's a think tank that supplies the American empire with intelligence. Stephen Simon refers to the phenomena, he calls it ummatitis. Ummatitis. He refers to it as a disease wherein young Muslims associate and affiliate themselves with a global ummah rather than associating with local affiliations. So even the American empire has come to recognize that there is this global Islamic sense of solidarity and this sense of, and these Islamic sentiments, to the extent that Stephen Simon warns of a coming clash of civilizations, which ultimately means a clash with colonial politics.
Okay, in this feeling of ummatitis, is there any way of Muslims thinking globally but still acting locally with the same effectiveness or with the same enthusiasm? Because that is another criticism that some detractors have that I've heard, that Muslims think, especially now with the politics in the UK right now, with recent elections that happened in Rochdale, a lot of people have been saying, well, Muslims are not thinking locally, they're thinking outside of, they're thinking internationally when we have problems here locally. Is there any way of basically killing two birds with one stone?
Yeah, so it's important also to clarify here that domestic politics and international politics are not two different courses of action. Domestic politics is shaped by foreign politics, and foreign politics shapes domestic politics. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we need a fruitful balance between our engagement with domestic politics and our global vision. Now, in order for us to be able to articulate a global vision, but at the same time engage with local politics, in my personal opinion, from my experience, we need an Islamic movement, right, that is global. A global Islamic movement that can prioritize global action, but at the same time channel some of our energies locally. Now, this is a strategic question, and it remains to be seen how and when and where that would emerge from. I think that's an unfolding question.
Okay. In your book, you place both non-Muslim and Muslim decolonial scholarship in dialogue with each other in a thought-provoking, imaginative, and mutually enriching way. Do you think that both groups of thinkers have something important to learn from each other? Do you envision a place for decolonial Muslim thinkers as playing a crucial role in the project of the Muslim Ummah reclaiming its alterity? How do you think decolonial Muslim thinkers could themselves utilize the Quran in forming their own liberation philosophies?
So there's a tremendous amount that we can learn from the decolonial camp, and there's a tremendous amount that the decolonial camp can learn from Muslim decolonial thinkers. That's the first thing. Why? Because the decolonial discourse and the liberation theology discourse that is emerging from Latin America, and the now emerging Muslim liberation theology, Muslim liberation theology that is emerging from the Muslim world, they are both born out of a shared experience. Both the Latin American context and the Muslim world context emerged out of an encounter with savage capitalism and with military and authoritarian dictatorships. And both camps sought to understand the modalities of oppression and sought to produce concepts that illuminate what is savage capitalism and what are these military dictatorships and the origins of oppression and so forth. So there's a shared phenomenon that we are both trying to understand. And so it follows that we can learn mutually from the ways in which we engage with this shared phenomenon. Of course, there are specificities to each camp, but also there's a shared experience. So just to give you one example, the decolonial camp has this idea, this concept called coloniality. Coloniality means that we cannot understand colonization in purely political, economic, or social terms. We must understand colonization as being multiple power structures that are integrated and interrelated, one of which is an epistemic power structure, meaning that the only legitimate center for knowledge production is the West. So you have the political power structure, the economic power structure, the social power structure, the patriarchal power structure, and the epistemic structure. Now, this concept of coloniality can illuminate our situation in the Muslim world, especially this idea of epistemic power structures and knowledge production as being exclusively emerging from the center. And there are Islamic concepts that the decolonial camp can learn from, such as the idea of Tawheed and the concept of action and choice in Islam, and so forth and so forth. Now, there is an emerging school in the Muslim world of decolonial Muslim thinkers. For example, Sayyid Mustafa Ali, Farid Isa, Iskandar Abbasi, and others. So this is an emerging camp, and it's emerging through an engagement with decolonial scholarship in Latin America.
I mean, apart from the fact that obviously your engagement with non-Muslim thinkers is very interesting, and like you said, it enhances sort of cross-pollination between different traditions. A lot of your arguments and interpretations of Quranic terms draw quite heavily on non-Muslim existential philosophers like Heidegger, for example. You've mentioned obviously that you believe that your arguments are incredibly based in Islamic tradition, in the Sirah, in Quranic terminology and central ideas. But how would you respond to the concern that in sort of drawing quite heavily on non-Muslim thinkers like Heidegger, you're obscuring an authentic and already established Islamic understanding of Quranic terminology, and you're almost perhaps further entrenching an imbalance between secular and Muslim knowledge production and scholarship about Islam? So why should a contemporary existentialist interpretation of the Quran, drawing on Western thinkers, take priority over historic readings that are found in the tafsirs?
Okay, another very good question. And I'm glad you brought it up, because this is something I wanted to address that I couldn't address in my book. Now, as Muslims, we have a very rich history and tradition of being able to engage with other philosophies. Aristotelian logic, Neoplatonic philosophy, Hellenistic philosophy, Roman law, Persian philosophy of statecraft, and so forth. So it is already part of tradition that we can creatively engage with these other philosophies. It's never been an issue, so long as we don't subvert and subordinate ourselves to the metaphysical commitments and the normative commitments of those philosophies. Now, there are certain concepts that emerge from non-Muslim circles that are descriptive rather than prescriptive, meaning that they seek to describe a particular phenomena. So, for example, when Marx speaks of commodity fetishism, or he speaks of economic exploitation. Now, if I, as a Muslim, were to come and say we are being economically exploited, somebody can come and say, oh, look, you're a Marxist. Whereas Marx was simply describing an existing reality. He was describing a phenomena. So I would not be labeled as a Marxist. Similarly, Heidegger and Kierkegaard and Gabriel Marcel, these existentialist thinkers, they were trying to describe a shared experience, which is, for example, what does it mean to be in the world? What is choice? What is decision? What is authenticity? So these are concepts that Muslims can draw upon because they are trying to describe an existing state of affairs rather than expressing a certain normative commitment or a sort of a kind of metaphysics. So as long as you have an Islamic framework, clear normative metaphysical commitments, you can subordinate certain secular concepts to understand your own tradition. But what would be negative and counterproductive is to have a secular framework and subordinate Islamic concepts to it.
In terms of talking about using non-Muslim thinkers to their sort of descriptions of or criticisms of, for example, commodity fetishism or secular liberalism, you quote Henri Dussel, one of the criticisms of secular liberalism that he vouches for, which is that you highlight that it is a system that closes in on itself, sacralizing itself as a divine whole, and that this act of closure is inherently connected to its prediction of the institutional corruption taken away from people, right? The power taken away from people that inevitably leads to institutional corruption. How do you feel about Muslims and non-Muslims who would levy the same criticism of corruption and a closing in on of itself, a secularization of a political system at current Islamic theocracies, and who as a result are very wary of the idea of the revival, for example, of the caliphate institution? And how is a political system founded on Islamic principles immune to the same process of self-fetishization and totalization that you accuse secular systems of? Do they not also run the risk of adopting the role of Taghut, like we have seen with some Islamic theocracies?
Okay, so first and foremost, the concept of state sovereignty is exclusively a modern concept. The idea of the nation state, the totalizing state, is a modern concept. And I wrote about this in my article entitled Inventing Sovereignty on the Genealogies of Modernity blog, or you can find it on my website. So the concept of state sovereignty is a modern concept. It does not exist in Islam. In Islam, the state was always understood to be an executive entity rather than a legislative identity. So the state in Islam does not close onto itself because one, it recognizes the sovereignty of the Sharia, and two, it recognizes the authority of the community. So in Islam, Sharia emerges out of a critical and dynamic engagement of the community with the question of legislation. So the state is not closed upon itself in terms of these two contingencies, the contingency of Sharia and the contingency of the Ummah. And the community engages with the Sharia and engages with the question of legislation through ijtihad and through shura. Now, that being said, this does not mean that we should not be critical of our own historical experience, meaning that we cannot whitewash the historical experience that we had with Bani Umayyah. No matter what we do, no matter what we say, we cannot deny the fact that there was political oppression under the reign of Bani Umayyah, and maybe to a lesser extent under the Abbasid Caliphate and so forth. So one of the things that Islamic liberation theology boldly does or should do is to engage with our history, but from a critical perspective. So to ask certain questions such as, how do we prevent, what can we learn from Bani Umayyah, from the oppression that we experience under Bani Umayyah? How can we learn from that and prevent that same reality in future Islamic politics? And this is essentially a question of ijtihad. What is this? How would Islamic governance look like? What would the role of shura be? What would be the scope of power that the caliph possesses, and so forth?
But in terms of criticisms of more, like, I understand what you're talking about in terms of historic Islamic governments and caliphates, but what about current Islamic theocracies and the criticisms levied at them? I'm speaking specifically in Iran, Afghanistan.
So, in my personal opinion, these Islamic states are only Islamic states by name. Why? Because they are not founded on two critical and legitimating acts, which is the act of shura and the act of bay'ah. So bay'ah essentially means election. It is a process of representational elections and so forth. And the principle of shura, which means that the community must be part and parcel of governance. So in my opinion, these states are not legitimate Islamic authorities. A legitimate Islamic authority remains to be seen, and this should be part of our global vision, retrieving that form of Islamic governance that is representational, that is built on shura. This should be part of our global vision, of our shared vision, and it should be the fruit of Islamic liberation theology that works on the ground and not just in the ivory towers of academia or armchair philosophizing.
Your book was triggered by a moment of political crisis and transformative upheaval in the Middle East, the Arab Spring, and you frame it in your book as a crucial moment of possibility and opportunity for an existential rebirth of the Muslim Ummah that offered the prospect of challenging the enforcement of a global secular liberal philosophical paradigm. We are currently living in another moment of great political crisis in the Middle East. If you were to write your book spurred by the current context, would you have reached the same conclusions as you did in your original work? Does this moment offer less of or a more critical opening to chart new futures than what you witnessed in 2011?
So I wrote this book quite recently, so not much has changed since I wrote it. But if I were to rewrite the book, I would address some of the setbacks that occurred with the Arab Spring. So the emergence, for example, of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in Egypt, or the setbacks of the Syrian revolution. I think that these developments, or the situation with the Nahda party in Tunis and so forth, I think that these developments should act as a catalyst for Islamic movements to engage in introspection, and for these Islamic movements to engage in self-criticism, to try to understand what are the causes of these setbacks, which are undeniable, the counter revolutions that occurred in Egypt, Tunis, Libya, Syria, so forth. So that's the first thing. That being said, the Arab Spring, in my opinion, is still an unfolding process, because the Arab Spring revealed a latent possibility that exists within the Ummah, which is revolution, which is change, which before 2011 was unthinkable. The idea of revolution in the Muslim world was unthinkable. So the Arab Spring revealed a potentiality that can be revived, but I think it can only be revived in light of a new strategic vision and a new philosophy of liberation that is not built around the idea of reform, but it's built around the idea of liberative revolution.
I have to ask this question because of the current context that we find ourselves in particular in your relation to your view about the Arab Spring and the leaders that emerged from that were not what was hoped for, essentially. We are currently in a state, obviously, where we're in an extreme crisis in the Middle East, and we're witnessing something that most of us have not been ever witnessed before in terms of what's happening in Palestine. How do you feel about the response to that by people who describe themselves as Muslim leaders? And how do you feel about what we should do as a populace in our frustration at that response?
So obviously, it goes without saying, and anyone who's lived in the Muslim world will attest to this, that any sort of discourse coming out from Muslim leaders is purely lip service, right? They are part and parcel of the problem. There's no doubt about that. And this is clearly understood by the intellectuals in the Muslim world and by the masses in the Muslim world. Now, it's not enough to make supplications, to make dua for the situation in Gaza, and paying lip service to the situation in Gaza is not sufficient. There must be, again, a global vision and a global strategy to try to engage with certain problems, such as the problem of Gaza. And the only way to do so, in my opinion, is to begin to think of agency at the level of the state, to begin to think of agency at a global level. So in what ways can the Muslim world represent itself on the global scene? It is only when we can become an actor on the global scene that we can strategically and in terms of action engage with the question of Gaza.
So do you almost feel that these Muslim leaders who are, as you say, are paying lip service to the humanitarian crisis in Palestine are colonized themselves, and we need to sort of decolonize those states?
Of course, 100%. 100%.
Do you believe that the sort of the geopolitical developments that we're witnessing point to the fact that we might be entering a multipolar world order in which the Western secular narrative ceases to be the predominant grand narrative and instead becomes one narrative in a sort of growing marketplace of ideas, And what opportunities would this open up for the self-actualization of the Muslim world and its ability to define itself in its own terms outside of colonization?
So first and foremost, in addition to there being an emergent multipolar world, which is debatable, it's debatable given the continuation of American hegemony. But let me concede and say, okay, there's the emergence of a multipolar world. There's also another interesting phenomenon. So Brzezinski, who is an ideologue of the American empire, warned in 2008, he warned of an emerging global consciousness, okay? And this included the sentiments that were emerging out of the Muslim world, which earlier I said was referred to as ummatitis and whatnot. Now, in order for us to be able to engage with the multipolar world, we need to, and I said this earlier, but it's worth repeating, that we need to think of agency at the level of state, at the level of the state. Because you cannot think of yourself as an actor in global politics unless you have a state, unless you have your own form of representation. So the only way we can enter world politics as a subject rather than as a passive object is to begin to think about the question of what would Islamic governance look like? What would an Islamic state begin to look like? This is a question which I think will require critical engagement within the Muslim world, within the Muslim community, and exercising ijtihad. Right? This is not a question that I can engage with because I'm just one individual and I'm not a scholar. Anyways, now that's the second thing. The third thing is that we need to think fast. And the question you're asking is a very urgent question, because the emergence of a multipolar world or the decline of the American empire means that there's a window, a narrow and limited window, limited in terms of time, for a strategic intervention, right? This is the moment wherein we can strategically intervene in global politics. But again, we can't do so unless we act as a state in global politics, as subjects in global politics rather than as objects in global politics. And we will remain as objects, passive objects in global politics, as long as we don't have our own state.
All right, and this is the last question, and we thank you for giving us your time to discuss.
It's my pleasure.
I mean, reading your book for myself was very eye-opening. It was the first of its kind. It was the first in that genre that I had a chance to read. So it really opened my eyes to a lot. I wish that I had inquired such philosophers and philosophical writings and all the things that you mentioned prior. But yeah, my interest just wasn't going in that direction until you diverted it with me reading your book. So yeah, my question is this: who are you looking for? Who are you looking for this work to appeal to? I believe you had a decent amount of good ideas, but the thing is, with a lot of these kinds of discussions, they appear to be had within academia and never seem to reach the masses of Muslims, many of whom Islamic liberation, philosophical and theological writings are speaking to. I guess what I'm asking is, how do you see this philosophy of Islamic liberation reaching the Muslims who this would benefit the most?
So in this book, I'm trying to speak to young Muslim intellectuals. So that's my audience. In future books, inshallah, I will try to speak to the wider Muslim community. Now, how do we translate a philosophy of Tawheed into a strategic vision or into a discourse that is accessible to the broader Muslim community? This, as Ali Shariati explains, is the role of the thinker, or in other places he calls him the intellectual. So or this idea of the organic intellectual, the intellectual that emerges from the womb of the oppressed, from the womb of the ummah. So it is the task of the intellectuals, by which I mean the Islamic movement, al-Haraka al-Islamiyya, to translate the philosophy of Tawheed into a strategic vision, into a strategic method of change for the Muslim world. And I think that this is not something that, I'm not a pessimist. I'm very optimistic that this is something which is unfolding in the Muslim world. This is something that it remains to be seen. It hasn't fully come into fruition, but I do believe that this is something which we will witness in our lifetime, in the coming years, inshallah.
God willing. Yeah, because I see myself as the masses who these kinds of writings need to reach, mainly because of just my limited engagement with such with this genre of Islamic liberation. Well, as Roxana, I would say she's more of the intellectual who has the capability of promoting these ideas and bringing them to the masses in a way that they can understand. I'm not saying that you're not that either. I'm just speaking within the context of Roxana and I. But this has been a wonderful interview. I've been extremely excited about this one. I wanted to kind of see how it was going to play out. Roxana has helped me along in this interview because, you know, I needed her to kind of break down and explain certain concepts and who certain these philosophical thinkers were. She's very familiar with Ali al-Shirati. But Brother Ali Harfoush, is there anything that you would like to leave us with? Is there any place that people can find you? You're very active on Twitter, so I'll leave your Twitter handle in the description. But is there a website that you can provide us with? And is there anything else that we can look out for concerning your writings, research, and other adventures that you have going on?
Yeah, so you can find my writings on my website, AS Harfoush, which is ASHARFOUCH.com. All my writings, I post it there in addition to any sort of media engagements or podcasts and so forth. You can find them there, inshallah, or through my Twitter handle.
All right. And if you don't have anything else to say, we can conclude this podcast. It's been an eye-opening one for myself, and I really hope to inquire more of Islamic liberation philosophy, because like I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, my mind, or what I thought of it at the outset, was totally different than what I come to find out it was about after reading your book, and also inquiring a few other Islamic liberation thinkers such as Farid. Sometimes I get people's names mixed up, but I think you know who I'm talking about. I found him to be very enlightening as far as unpacking what Islamic liberation philosophy was about. And I encourage our audience to as well inquire and engage with this type of writing, specifically your book, especially for those who have a background in this kind of genre. So yeah, with that, assalamu alaikum, and thank you for joining us on our podcast. And we hope to bring you back on maybe for other subjects so we can further unpack this idea of Islamic liberation theology.
Inshallah, inshallah. Thank you.